Just by training. I want to welcome you to Howard University today, and especially to the historic Founders Library, where this symposium is taking place. This library is the centerpiece of a complex of libraries serving the needs of a Class I research university. It also houses the Moreland Spingarn Research Center, one of the world's two largest collections of research materials on people of African descent. I trust that you will have an opportunity to visit the Moreland Spingarn Research Center on the ground level while you're here today. Howard University is host to numerous conferences, symposia, and meetings, and I, as president, am often called on to welcome you to such meetings. But I do so gladly, and especially today, at a time when we will be examining a topic of great importance. I must confess, however, to some trepidation. To tell the truth, it bothers me that here we are in 1994, seriously, and I mean very seriously, discussing and giving importance to yet another attempt to link race and ability. This subject seems to appear every decade or so, with yet another scholar taking what one calls a fresh look and approaching the issue from a very different perspective. Although I do not see that either of these two criteria has been met this time around, I suppose I do understand why it is important that we discuss the bell curve by Herenstein and Murray. It is a sign of the times that this book has received a tremendous amount of public attention. And this is not accidental, it seems to me, since the main purpose seems to be to promote social policy, a certain kind of policy which conforms to a given ideology. But my task is not to review the book, nor even to suggest the direction the discussion will take place here today. Mainly, I want to welcome you to Howard University and to assert once again our very, very strong devotion to free and open inquiry, and finally to introduce to you the co-sponsor, the Urban League's Hugh Price. Hugh Price became president of the Urban League last summer. Prior to joining the National Urban League, Mr. Price served as vice president of the Rockefeller Foundation. There he oversaw grant making to improve urban schools, to foster equal opportunity for minorities, and to alleviate urban poverty. Prior to joining the Rockefeller Foundation, Mr. Price was on the editorial board of the New York Times. Mr. Price.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ladner. The National Urban League is delighted to be sponsoring this symposium with Howard University, one of the citadels of learning in our country. As you know, the National Urban League is a social, economic, and racial justice organization committed to equal opportunity for all, and especially for African Americans who have been victimized historically and who are victimized to this day by prejudice and discrimination. We're deeply troubled by The Bell Curve, the book by Charles Murray and Richard Herenstein. While we acknowledge that the authors address trends that should worry us all, trends such as social dysfunction, out-of-wedlock births, and widening income gaps, and worsening economic prospects for low-wage workers, we're also disturbed by the research, the reasoning, and the policy recommendations in the book. For assistance, we turn to a distinguished group of scholars from various disciplines for their own assessment. These are scholars who share our commitment to equal opportunity and who have a long-standing interest in and involvement in the very scientific and policy issues raised by the book. We're delighted that they could join us today for this symposium, and I would like to introduce them in their order of remarks. First, to my right, Dr. Stephen J. Gould is the Alexander Agassiz Professor of Zoology and Professor of Geology at Harvard University. He is also a member of the Committee on Professors in the Department of Biology and an adjunct member of the Department of the History of Science at Harvard. Professor Gould earned his PhD from Columbia University and has been awarded 36 and counting doctorate degrees. His book, The Mismeasure of Man, won the National Book Critics Circle Award for General Nonfiction, the Outstanding Book Award by the American Educational Research Association, and the Iglesias Prize. Another book, Wonderful Life, won the Forkosh Award from the Council of Democratic Humanism for the best book on a humanistic subject, the Phi Beta Kappa Book Award in Science, and it was a nominee and finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Another book, Hen's Teeth and Horse's Toes, won the Phi Beta Kappa Book Award in Science. Professor Gould has also won numerous other awards, academic medals, and distinguished memberships. Next to Dr. Gould is Edmund W. Gordon. He is the John W. Musser Professor of Psychology, Emeritus from Yale University. He is also currently Distinguished Professor of Psychology at City College of New York and City University, as well as Director of the new Institute for Research on the African Diaspora in the Americas and the Caribbean. His distinguished career spans professional practice, scholarly life as a minister, clinical and counseling psychologist, and as a research scientist, author, editor, and professor. Professor Gordon is best known for his research on and concern for diverse human characteristics and pedagogy, and on the education of low-status persons. He served for 3 years as editor of the annual Policy of Research in Education journal. Dr. Gordon is perhaps best known for his research on diverse human characteristics, and his book, Compensatory Education, Preschool through College, continues to be regarded as the classic work in his field. To my immediate right is Dr. Nancy Cole. Dr. Cole is president of the Educational Testing Service, and there she is responsible for guiding America's largest educational research and measurement organization. Dr. Cole is regarded nationally as an expert in test fairness. Among her many published reports are a paper in the Journal of Educational Measurement on approaches to test bias. She has also written other articles on test bias, which are frequently cited. Her record as a scholar and policy advisor in the field of assessment was recognized in 1988 by her election as president of the American Educational Research Association. In the 4 years prior to joining ETS, Dr. Cole served as Dean of Education and professor at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where she was involved in national and statewide reform initiatives for improving schools and teacher education. For those of you who don't know, ETS is the world's largest private educational measurement institution and a leader in educational research. It develops and administers achievement, occupational fellow at the American Statistical Association, the Royal Statistical Society, the National Association of Business Economists, and the American Association for the Advancement of Science, Dr. Norwood has received many honors and awards, including presidential rank as Distinguished Executive in the U.S. Senior Executive Service. Janet Norwood has written extensively on statistical and labor market issues, has served as president of the American Statistical Association and vice president of the International Statistical Institute. She has served as the chair of the Board of Trustees of the National Institute of Statistical Science. In January of 1993, the president named Dr. Norwood to chair a new advisory council on unemployment compensation. To Dr. Norwood's left is W. Curtis Banks, professor of psychology and director of honors at the College of Arts and Sciences at Howard University. Dr. Banks has served as consultant and senior research scientist at the Educational Testing Service, as consultant to the U.S. Office of Education's Desegregation General Assistance Center at Columbia University Teachers College, at the National Institute of Education, and for the City of Minneapolis in the Department of Civil Rights. Dr. Banks serves as editor of the Journal of Black Psychology from 1978 to 1987. He has also served on the Education Advisory Committee for the State of New Jersey's Department of Education, on the Committee for the Assessment for the United States Department of Labor's SCANS study, and on the Assessment Task Force of the National Council on Education Standards and Testing. As you see, we have a distinguished panel with us today, and to open, I would ask that Dr. Stephen J. Gould lead us off. Dr. Gould.
When a scientist analyzes a book like this, I think we tend to look at two aspects of the presentation. First, the logic of argument, and second, its empirical adequacy. That is, first of all, does the argument hold? and secondly, they have any evidence to back it up. And I think on both accounts, the bell curve, though it's thick in the sense that it's heavy to carry around with its 800 pages, it's really awfully thin. It's a very one-dimensional argument whose logic is quite faulty and proven to be so. And as for the empirical issues, they only report half their data, at least up front, namely the half that seems to follow their point of view. The rest that doesn't is buried in Appendix 4, and I'll come to that. I should say that my remarks are a précis of a review I wrote in the New Yorker in the November 28th issue. The logic is based on an argument that is not in itself uninteresting. And were its premises true, which they're not, it would represent a real dilemma. It's not a stupid argument, it's just its premises turn out to be false. And that is that in the bad old non-egalitarian days, when you are in the upper classes by virtue of your name or your inherited wealth, and if you happen to be in the lower classes, no matter how brilliant you are, you couldn't rise, there was no way that cognitive stratification could occur on a class basis, because you couldn't rise if you were smart, so you stayed low, and you couldn't fall if you were high because you did it by virtue of name rather than ability. The paradox is that as society becomes more truly egalitarian and gives equality of opportunity, I'm not saying we have any of this, I'm just giving the logic of the argument, that ironically, along with equality of opportunity, should come cognitive stratification, because now the bright ones in the lower classes can rise, the dumb ones in the upper classes will fall, and as an ironic result of equalization of opportunity, you get a worse form of genetically based cognitive stratification. I should say Murray and Herrnstein didn't invent this argument. This is the basis of 19th century social Darwinism. It's a very old argument. The bell curve is constructed in two parts based on that argument. The first, which represents the first two parts of the book, is a claim that class differences in America have been so stratified. The second part, which is as long as the first part, though Murray's been running from it and claiming he never said it or never meant it to be important, is that racial differences in America are also so genetically and innately and relatively immutably stratified. All right, now here's the problem with the logic of the argument. That potentially interesting argument only works if four sequential premises are true, and all four of them have to be true. I suspect that only one of them may be true. First of all, intelligence has to be meaningfully representable, whatever we mean by that term, as a single entity, according to which you can rank people, so that you can make an assessment. So you can say, well, this person is a 50, and this one's 100, and this one's 120. Because if intelligence is something else, if in particular it's large numbers of effectively independent abilities in which some people are good in one thing and other people are good in another thing, then there isn't going to be any single entity by which you can rank people. Now, there's an old argument whose mathematical fallacies should be clear. I wrote a whole chapter in The Mismeasure of Man on it. It goes back to a man named Charles Spearman in 1904 who developed via a mathematical artifact the concept that he called G, or the general factor of intelligence. G has never had any justification other than the one provided by this technique of factor analysis that Spearman gave it in 1904. And I think it's invalid. If I had 20 minutes, I'd explain why. We can perhaps get to it in the question period. All right, so that's statement number one. You have to believe that you can abstract intelligence as a single number. Secondly, you have to be able to rank people by that number in a single order. That then has to correlate with their achievements in life. Thirdly, that single number, G, the general factor by which you've ranked people, must be largely inherited or genetic in origin. And fourthly, you're not there yet, it has to be immutable. You see, there's a standard misinterpretation of what it means to say something's heritable. Unfortunately, in vernacular English, the word heritable tends to mean immutable, unchangeable, and we tend to think that if we say that IQ is heritable, which it is, that therefore we mean it can't be changed. That's not what heritable means. It just isn't. Heritability is a measure of the genetic basis of correlation between parents and offspring and relatives. It has nothing to do with mutability or immutability. For example, I may have a 100% heritable, rather serious defective vision, and I go to Kmart and I buy these for $15 and it's fine. I have cured it. Similarly, IQ could be highly heritable, but strongly melioratable, if that's a word, in the same sense that Head Start and other programs might function like the pair of glasses. So the fact that it's heritable doesn't mean it's immutable, and Herrnstein and Murray have to have that immutability. Because if all the other things were true, namely that intelligence is a single thing in the head, that it's rankable, that the ranks correlate, that it's genetic, if it wasn't immutable, then all their conclusions fail and turn into the opposite, because if it's highly mutable by programs of intervention continued, then the social message is not theirs that we should abandon all affirmative actions, but it should be we should try twice as hard to make sure we ameliorate the heritable differences between people by appropriate intervention. I don't want to spend more time on that except to say that of those four arguments, I think only heritability it can be made, and it doesn't mean what most people think it means. The central fallacy is this rather silly notion that there's a meaningful way in which such a complex notion as inheritance could be encompassed by a single number with a genetic basis. I think Spearman's G is a real fallacy. What's really a giveaway of the disingenuousness of the Herrnstein and Murray book is that they do not even attempt to present the rationale for G, which is rooted in a mathematical technique called factor analysis. They mention it in fleeting in 2 paragraphs. And that's all they ever say about it. They acknowledge halfway through the first chapter that there are 3 major schools of interpretation, their own and 2 others, one associated with Sternberg, one with Gardner, which have different readings of intelligence. And then they simply say, but we're only going to talk about the first one because essentially everyone agrees and it's right. They just told us that not everybody agrees. And in fact, I happen to associate myself more with Gardner's position than any of the others. Let me then move to point 2, the empirics of the study, in which I actually got quite angry as I read the book because I think they did something that just doesn't live up to appropriate scholarly standards. The book is just full of numbers, and that scares reviewers away. It's 840-something or other pages, and therefore you think it's rich and deep. It isn't. It's a one-dimensional study based on a single set of data. I don't think they necessarily treated the data wrongly. I think, in fact, what they did was probably the best they could do with that data set. But it's not a book like Jensen's Bias and Mental Testing, which, much as I disagree with it, is at least a scholarly book based on hundreds and thousands of studies and lots of different arguments and has to be so treated. Here's all Herrnstein and Murray did. But they've bamboozled everybody by throwing in so many numbers. People think it's somehow much more complex and well documented. They took, and other panelists know more about this than I do, a remarkable set of data, the National Labor Survey of Youth, which has traced some 13,000 people through their lifetimes, or parts of their lifetimes, so-called longitudinal survey. And they have done what's called a multiple regression analysis by plotting as dependent variables all those things that trouble us: chronic welfare dependency, children out of wedlock, divorce rates, crime, etc. They have plotted them against 2 so-called dependent variables, namely IQ, which they take as a surrogate for a genetic factor largely, and parental socioeconomic status, which they take as a marker of what your environment gives you. They then plot all those variables against IQ, but holding parental SES constant, and then they do the reverse. They plot it against parental SES, holding IQ constant. And all they have found, I don't think it's a bad technique, it's what I would have done too, is that in general, the correlations with IQ are stronger. That is, the bad things that they're measuring as dependent variables tend to correlate more strongly with low IQ than with low parental SES. I don't know the cause of that. It could be many. It could just be that parental SES is less well measured than IQ. I don't know the reasons, or it could be what they say. However, anyone who's ever done regression analysis, I'll defer to a statistician at the other end. I'm not a professional statistician, though I use statistics all the time in my technical work. When you do such a regression analysis, there are 2 things you have to present. You have to present the so-called form of the regression, but you also have to present the scatter of the points around that regression, because with a sample of 13,000, almost any regression is going to have statistical significance, which is a technical notion that doesn't necessarily conform to vernacular ideas of significance. So yes, their regression equations are statistically significant, and that's all they show. There's 100 pages in part 2 of their book that shows regression curve after regression curve, mostly showing that the correlations with IQ are higher when SES is held constant than with SES when IQ is held constant. Fine. They never show the scattering of points around those regressions. They do admit at one point in the beginning that because the scatter is high, you can't judge individuals thereby. all the conventional measurements of scatter, so-called R-squared, or coefficients of determination, are buried in Appendix 4 of their book. Now, why would you... Any statistics course I ever took told me it is a norm that you present your regression curves and the scatter around that regression, either as points or standard errors or whatever, and they just don't. They just show the regression curves. Now, why would you only show the regression curve and not the scatter? Could it be that the regression curve is pretty much in line with their conclusions, but the scatter isn't? You see, the point is simply this. The scatter is so great, the so-called R-squares are so low, that for almost every one of those regressions, they're explaining somewhere between a couple percent and 10% of the information. In other words, although the correlations, the regressions are in the right direction for their conclusions, they are so weak that they're effectively doing no work for them, from which I would have thought the only fair conclusion is that and neither IQ nor parental SCS are doing a great deal relative to the variation among individual human beings, which of course means that you cannot use low IQ to make any meaningful predictions about individuals which they acknowledge, but that even the effect on groups is very small indeed. And again, I simply close by saying you shouldn't be scared of the book because there are numbers there. They do write clearly, grant them that. Any intelligent person can penetrate that book and find the errors, and it's the scientism of the attempt to obfuscate by numbers and not really render yourself to scrutiny. That's really our fault, not theirs.
Thank you. Dr. Gordon.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm going to do just two things in my introductory remarks. First is to talk a little bit about why we've got a book like this, and a little bit about some of the things that I think should lead us to look at it with a serious question. Our society is really in serious trouble. At this particular time, a worldwide economic, political, and social transition. Things are changing, and those of us who are reasonably well positioned are just about as worried that things may get worse as are those who have been greatly dislocated by these changes. Now, it's in a climate like this that people get worried about protecting their status, protecting what is theirs and, you know, what belongs to people like themselves. It's also in this kind of climate that a book like The Bell Curve can be published and promoted. Actually, its promotion is probably more important than its publication. It could have been published and kind of lost like most books are, or ignored as too many important books are. In this particular book, and a colleague of mine at Yale, Jay Gould, has just referred to Bob Sternberg. Bob has written a review of the Bell Curve, and he titles it, For whom does the Bell Curve toll? And he answers, it tolls for you. Now, in this case, we've got two people who present themselves, and I suppose in a sense kind of represent the epitome of what they would call intelligent people. They have a unique capacity to manipulate both numbers and ideas to either represent reality or misrepresent it, one of the characteristics of intelligence. And they use that ability and the vehicle that they have to attack the sense of polity, the sense of membership, the sense of community, the sense of inclusiveness, at a time when they must recognize, as all of the rest of us recognize, that that sense is under threat, because in human societies, when one senses scarcity or perceives or even misperceives that things may be scarce, we do begin to, tend to the circling of the wagons to protect that which is ours. And what I see in the book is really a justification for, in another context, I call it a polemic in support of selfishness. A group of people who are claiming now that the science justifies our excluding from responsibility by the society of a segment of the population that we can declare as not just different or other or inferior, undeserving of concern, undeserving of inclusion. Now, the book is rather cleverly orchestrated, though. It begins with no attention to what I think is the undercurrent of the book, no attention to race, simply trying to establish a genetic basis for, if you want to call it, the underclass. After having established that, they, of course, call our attention to the fact that black people are a large part, are disproportionately represented in that underclass, and assert to these lower class people, these underclass people, whether they be black or white, a immutable, genetically determined inferiority. And of course, they suggest that their position in the society and society's efforts at trying to remediate these persons has been unsuccessful. Now, toward the end of the book, they introduce a rather interesting concern for this group of people, though. It's almost a charitable concern. And if you go back to my earlier concern with their laying the basis now for narrowing the group of persons for whom we would be responsible, I sense that what they are saying there is that if the society can view these persons with charity, if things get bad enough, the society has no responsibility, since charitable work is kind of voluntary. These people have no rightful claim on the resources of the society. So it puts them in a position that they can be excluded. I remind you of Sternberg's metaphor of the tolling bell. It reminds me sound effects.
John Dunn's version is better.
A little bit of humor helps, but it's really at the wrong point, because I was about to say that Sternberg's use of the metaphor, of course, reminds us that the rise of fascism in Europe was in a similar period and carried with it a similar set of ideas. Having said that, I do find a number of problems with the book. In a review that I've been preparing, I began by talking about expressing my impatience with having to return to this debate again and again. I think it's about the second time, at least if not the third, in my career. I do happen to have lived a long time. But 25 years ago, in a book on science and the concept race that Margaret Mead edited, we thought that we dealt adequately with this issue, certainly dealt with it much more scientifically, with greater quality than the current treatment. Back in, when was it, 81, my neighbor to my right wrote what I think is the definitive work on the subject. Very recently, Sternberg has published an encyclopedia of intelligence. Some of it I would have some problems with, but the substance of that book would move us in a different direction. What is troubling about the resurgence of the notion is that it gains so much attention. And I argue, to take us back to my beginning point, I argue that that attention derives from the fact that we do live in a troubled time, we do live in a troubled period when all of us are kind of scared to death and out there searching for answers. And the problem is that in the absence of better answers, this particular perspective may prevail at a time when it's politically fashionable. A second kind of concern has to do with the use of, or the confusion, I guess, in the author's use of the science itself. I don't need to pursue this point too much because Professor Gould has already talked about the confusions around heritability, genetics. Just about everything in human behavior could be said to be genetic in the sense that if you didn't have the genetic basis for the development of the organism, none of it would be possible. But the behavior geneticists also tell us that everything is 100% environmental. And that's because if you didn't have whatever the genetic material is interacting with environmental forces, you wouldn't have what we call phenotype, the product of it. And the point that he made that I simply want to endorse here is that not only do the authors confuse the fact that genetics is an important scientific phenomenon with their distortion of the heritability issues, which really relate to the likelihood that particular characteristics will appear in populations. And then they confound this with the assumption that somehow because it's genetic or because it's heritable, it's unchangeable. If there were time, and we may come back to it, they go to some length to demean the many human efforts at doing something about the human condition. Interestingly, at one point in the book, they even acknowledge that some of this has worked or has the potential for working, but quickly shift to deny the possibility that any large-scale intervention into the upgrading of human abilities or the human condition is possible. Hugh looks like he's looking at me that my time is running out, so let me make just one other point. Maybe I'll take one of my final points. Suppose Herrnstein and Murray were right. Suppose we did inherit all of our characteristics. And suppose there were some limits on the capacity for change. What could we do? They seem to think that warehousing the population of folk whose abilities are not so highly developed would be a solution. In discussions between several of us and in some other settings, we have recognized that that would be potentially dangerous. Again, some 30 years ago, Benjamin Bloom, writing on this subject, suggested that no matter what the facts of genetics are, there's only one option open to a humane society, and that's to intervene with the best of the human services that you can find, to intervene with the best of the education that you can find, to do what humans have done throughout the history of humanity, and that is to try to do the best we can with what we've got.
Thank you, Dr. Wood. Next up, Dr. Nancy Cole, President of the Educational Testing Service.
Thank you. I'm going to speak to three issues: to the issue of the science of the book, the way the book treats tests, and the political message of the book. And I'm going to reiterate some of the issues of the science of the book that have already been noted, in part because they've been so much neglected in the general press coverage of the book. And as perhaps you, like I, have been frequently seen and been met with, well, I can't evaluate the science of the book, but, and that's been a very common response in the press that we've seen. And I think it's very important for us to share the analysis of the science of the book with the general public, and particularly because the book presents itself as a scientific inquiry into the supposedly inevitable state of differences that exist among people. And I want to make clear to you that in my judgment the book is bad science. And I want to list a few of the aspects of the book that are bad science. For a book centrally on intelligence, it amazingly ignores questions of the fundamental nature of intelligence. It relies instead on all of our informal, commonly held belief about intelligence, and we have very diverse and rich senses ourselves about what intelligence must mean. And it leaves us to all of those, but in the book it narrows it to very narrow measures of cognitive capability and skills that are measured by tests. It depends on statistical analyses that are at best grossly misleading. As Professor Gould described, its own data show the relationships on which it's building to be extremely weak, data buried in the appendices, and certainly far too weak to compel a particular social action. The treatment of hereditability, as both the speakers have said, is enormously discouraging because we have been through these issues before. They treat the word and our own naive associations with the word hereditability that the general public associates with the immutability of characteristics, and they feed on those interpretations where it's been known for many years that the kind of hereditability data that's presented here do not support immutability, and that this is a fallacy of the use of the hereditability indices. It presents data extremely selectively, ignoring data that contradicts its theses, and particularly ignores most data on educational interventions that create improvements. And it's rather easy to reach conclusions that educational interventions cannot create improvements if you ignore all the data addressed to those that do. It fails to explore scientifically the nature of inferences it tries to make, and instead relies on the assumptions and impressions that it gives readers for its leap from data to implications for social or political action. Inference that the data in this book support the immutability of human characteristics is not seriously explored as an inferential leap in the book, nor is it supported by the book's data. So although the book is a clear attempt to use the trapping of science to create the illusion that a political policy conclusion is inevitable and supported by science, in fact the book is properly viewed as a treatise on political policy. And since the book's bad science, that attempt is especially dangerous. A word about the tests. The notion that tests measure immutable human characteristics is especially galling to me. The tests reported are known to involve characteristics that are learned and characteristics that are strongly associated with other factors of life that support learning. I think the American public has a long history of wishing to believe tests tell us something that they don't, and fail to look very simply at the kind of questions on tests to be disabused of those beliefs. The kinds of questions on the tests used in this book, as all tests, have to do with the kind of language and quantitative and knowledge skills that a person has at a given point in time. They will look very much like our culture. They will look like things you learned in school. They will look like things we expect our children to learn and we try to teach them through their childhood. We fail to look at the basic kinds of data that these associations are being made with, or we wouldn't be duped by the interpretations. No reader should believe that test performance is scientifically proved to be an immutable, inborn thing in the brain that requires one person to grow up smart and another person to grow up dumb. Finally, let me turn to the political message. The social thesis of the book is a type of justification for the haves of this society, a justification that the have-nots deserve to have not. This very appeal to the self-interest, the selfishness, as Professor Gard mentioned, of those who have the benefits of the society to exclude permanently those who do not, is hugely disturbing. And personally, the most disturbing characteristic of the book, to me, is that it attempts to absolve us from the critical necessity to deal more effectively with issues of poverty, class, and race. Serious issues raised by the book, and serious issues, but it attempts to absolve us of having to deal with them by convincing us that the negative effects are inevitable and not subject to constructive action. I can think of no more incorrect or harmful message that could be delivered today to the people of the United States, and I want to correct that message.
Thank you, Dr. Cole. Next, Dr. Janet Norwood of the Urban Institute and formerly Commissioner of Labor Statistics.
Thank you. The book by Herrnstein and Murray finds that intelligence, as measured through various tests, is highly correlated with inheritance. They conclude that the genetically influenced intelligence of particular groups of the population can be measured with reasonable accuracy, that such measurement produces substantially different results for each racial or ethnic group, and that on average, the 60% or so of intelligence which the authors find in the genes has a profound effect on the cognitive ability of different racial and ethnic groups to function in our economy. Although the book covers many racial and ethnic groups, the most highly publicized result is that the authors find a substantial discrepancy in tested intelligence between the black and the white populations, and that these group intelligence characteristics account for a large part of the differences between American blacks and whites in educational and economic outcomes. Although the authors use many studies to discuss these issues, many of the statistical calculations, especially those on the test scores for blacks and for whites, are based on data from the National Longitudinal Survey. The National Longitudinal Survey for Youth, which is called the NLSY in short. The NLSY, a government survey sponsored by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, is designed to follow individuals in particular age cohorts over time to get information on their labor market and related experiences. The Armed Forces Qualification Test, the AFQT, was administered in the NLSY in 1980 to respondents first surveyed in the previous year, and about 94% of the original sample took the test. Herrnstein and Murray tell us in Appendix 2 of the book, and by the way, one of the big problems is that they tell you you can read the book 3 ways. I would tell you you have to read the book 4 ways, which is to read the appendices and the footnotes. They tell us in Appendix 2 of the book that they applied new weights to the survey data each year to make their analyses. Their results, of course, represent only those in the original age cohort who took the test, those who were 18 to 23 years old in 1979. The authors appear to make the assumption that this 5-year age class provides information representative of the white and the black populations as a whole. While this may in some ways be a reasonable approach, 2 points should be made. First, immigration into the United States increased markedly during the 80s, and of course these new immigrants who were not there in 1979 are not represented in the original sample, the cohort that was given the AFQT test. Secondly, the NLSY originally enlarged the sample for blacks in order to enhance the quality of the data on black respondents, and has continued to have very high response rates. Nevertheless, we shouldn't forget that the sample for blacks is still much smaller than the sample for whites. Although the NLSY provides a much larger ratio of blacks to whites than most other surveys, detailed comparisons of blacks to whites may be affected by somewhat larger sampling errors for the black group. The National Longitudinal Survey, I would argue, is an extremely important national survey. It would be vastly improved if its sample sizes were larger. One problem with analysis of comparisons between black and white IQ is that there is really no sure way to determine the accuracy of the racial data in any of our statistical classifications. Definitions of race and ethnicity in this country are very much affected by changing views of history, of culture, and of social conditions. More than a century ago, the decennial census, recognizing that some of the American population reflected a mixture of European and African backgrounds, collected data on blacks, mulattoes, quadroons, and octoroons. Attitudes in this country have changed, however, and today the classifications used in the United States statistical system require respondents to identify themselves as members of a single racial or ethnic group. That is, white, black or Negro, Eskimo, Aleut, and Pacific Islander. To get more information on how people looked at these issues, in 1990, the 1990 census included an other race category in addition to the 6 race groups that were covered in the 1980 census. In spite of the additional category, several million Americans did not answer the race question at all, and 9.8 million census respondents wrote entries in the other race category. It seems clear that some Americans with mixed backgrounds prefer to identify themselves as multiracial. But to reach conclusions about black-white inherited differences, one would have to divide people into 2 groups, one of pure whites and one of pure blacks. Now, the authors devote considerable attention to the development and analysis of a socioeconomic status index, which they use primarily to test for environmental as distinct from IQ effects. This index is based on data representing the parents of the NLSY respondents and includes information on the parents' years of schooling, income, and occupation. One can question whether these 3 variables, while important, are sufficient to make judgments about the effect of the environment and educational and economic outcomes of different groups of the population. In fact, Murray and Herrnstein review several studies which use different variables and come to different conclusions. But then they discard them to return to their own assumptions. The bell curve includes a chapter discussing the increased stratification of the American labor market into high-income and low-income jobs and workers, and its implications for the future. I think we can all agree with the authors that our society is becoming increasingly stratified, and about the rising importance of cognitive ability and education for success in the job market. The restructuring of industry that occurred in the United States over the last decade and the increasing globalization of the labor market have clearly made American industry more competitive in the world economy. But they have also made it harder for those who have not had the benefit of the educational skills and discipline now required by so many American employers. Difficult as these problems are, the American labor market remains characterized by a great deal of individual mobility. People continue to get jobs, to lose jobs, and to move in and out of the labor force. And although jobs and pay from those jobs are stratified more now than in the past, individuals do continue to move upward and downward into different income classes. The fact that the income return from college and graduate school education has increased in recent years should result in more emphasis on the need both to improve our educational system and for more Americans to hone their skills. There is nothing in these labor market developments to suggest that change is not possible. If there is any benefit to the book, it is that it shows the need to review and to rethink the programs we have to help those who are less fortunate in our society. It is important to expand those programs that work well and to discard those that do not. This is essential because democracy cannot long survive when there are large, nearly permanent divisions between those who have and those who have not. It is this approach in the Herrnstein-Murray book that I think is the real danger of the book. One final comment. The book is full of references, graphs, and statistical discussion, and yet many of its most important inferences are drawn from assumptions that are based on diverse sets of data, some from very small samples. In fact, Murray himself, in his comments, quotes several situations in which he makes it clear that very little is actually known. He says, if you look at his piece in the New Republic, he says that many of the things that he said may well be inaccurate. And he goes on and on in that vein. In addition, correlation is frequently confused with causation. And the explanatory values in much of the statistical analysis found in Appendix 4 seem weak enough to cast some doubt on the conclusions made. I'd also like to reinforce what Stephen Gould said. The authors should have presented data on the scatter of observations around the regression lines. This is especially important, I think, and it's especially strange that they did not do so, because the authors make such a strong point in the book about the fact that within the group, the results differ from those for individuals. The group differences as a whole are different from the differences for individuals. The authors certainly recognize that their answers are not always certain and at times may not even be completely accurate. Nevertheless, statements based on them appear frequently throughout the entire book.
Thank you, Dr. Norwood. Next, Professor Curtis Banks from Howard University.
This book, as a discourse in science, proves false the old saying that if it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, then it must be a duck. Sometimes things that quack aren't ducks, they're just quacks. Maybe, having said that, I'll get some of the sarcasm off my chest. I thought I'd have to apologize for an irrepressible feeling of cynicism in reviewing this book, because books like this tend to dangerously reduce us to that kind of cynicism and even sarcasm. But obviously, from the comments that we've heard thus far, I'm in a crowd of cynics. I find this book very convincing on 2 points. Intelligence is suffered in the context of affirmative action, and that intelligence is inherent. Just read the book. There's not a speck of intelligence in it. One gets the sense that the topic of affirmative action has driven intelligence out of discussions, even scholarly discussions. Is that lack of intelligence inherent or acquired? We find that this phenomenon passes 2 important tests of heritability. A, historically, that absence of intelligent discourse has always been present on this topic. And B, across time and context, it seems not to vary. Even when intelligent people speak on this topic, they often seem to do so in a most unintelligent way. Take the present instance. Dr. Herrnstein is a very intelligent man. I know. He accepted 2 of my articles for the journal he was editing during the 1970s when I was a young assistant professor. And ever since, I've numbered him among the most intelligent people I know. Why, then, is this book so painfully devoid of intelligence? It must be inherent. Not in the men who wrote it so much as in the thesis they try so desperately to advance. Attacks upon fairness, equity, and the solution of injustice are inherently unintelligent, a condition which all the scientific remediation in the world is powerless to change. Now, it might be customary against such criticism for these authors to protest that their project of remediation was simply too weak a test of the hypothesis of remediability, that stronger, more vigorous interventions would surely satisfy us that such a thesis can be put forth with high intelligence. I, for one, remain skeptical. True, the case they make in this book is weak indeed, but I'm convinced that it's the strongest case available to them. And I'm convinced that this sow's ear argument cannot be made into a silk purse by all the science and statistics they or anyone else can assemble. I might even go so far as to conjecture that science is largely antithetical to their argument. That might explain why they have left so much of it out of their discussion. 26 years ago, Walter Mischel undertook the most rigorously scientific examination before or since into not only the construct of measured intelligence, but every other major stable attribute ascribed to human personality. He found that all the assembled evidence failed to demonstrate that any of these traits correlated above approximately 0.50 with the behaviors they purported to explain or predict. No mention is made of that work in this present book. Perhaps the authors thought it unnecessary to reference something that their own work already agreed with. You will note that the bell curve cites essentially the same levels of correlation as Mischel cited in his book. Most would not consider this oversight in citation a scientifically damnable offense. But what many would consider a damnable offense is the misleading way in which the bell curve portrays the significance of these correlations in the face of Mischel's earlier, more thoroughgoing analysis. The bell curve, for example, in Chapter 3, makes much of the correlation between a cognitive test score and performance, a correlation they report in table as 0.53. What is conceded in the text, however, is that this correlation might be more accurately 0.40. But let's not quibble. At any rate, their boast upon this number is that it is very high for social science correlations and that it is higher than every other correlation in the table, which includes coefficients for biographical data, references, education, and college grades, all to predict job performance. The table would leave many readers with the impression that better than half of what needs to be known about performance is validly measured by a cognitive test. The authors have already instructed the reader to remember and to watch out for the magnitude of these correlations. But they neglect to instruct the reader that the statistical meaning of a correlation of 0.53 is that the cognitive test score explains only 28% of the variability in performance. The more correct correlation of 0.40 would indicate the test explains only 16% of variability in performance. In fact, all the measures taken together from the table would explain less than half, approximately 46%, of what will ultimately be observed in actual performance on the job. Equally damnable is the incorrect way in which the bell curve defines validity by reference strictly to correlation coefficients. Readers are instructed that correlation and validity are identical. To quote, "Wrong. Validity is a scientific concept which denotes the accuracy of an instrument in measuring the property it is designed for. Correlation is a statistical procedure for relating data from an instrument with data from some separate and independent source. The correlation coefficient is a summary index of the strength of the relationship thus found. When high enough, such a coefficient may, I repeat, may lend support to the validity of the instrument, but only when considered in the light of other logically relevant correlations. There are even some forms of validity, such as content validity, that may not involve any correlational analyses at all." But enough of this ivory tower nitpicking over the esoterics of definitions and statistics. We can do that forever. The bell curve makes considerable noise about taking us where the academic theorists and liberal ideologists can't cut it, out where the work is, in the real world of cost and benefits, of feasibility and practicality. Now, of course, the bell curve, when it gets to the real world issues, does what academicians all too often do. It begins to whimper and whine. Unbiased tests are too costly, it says. Technical standards are too stringent, it says. Good tests, valid tests based on level fields of measurement and that lack adverse impact are, to quote the book, difficult or impossible. Nonsense. And here's why. Contrary to the picture painted in the book's appendix of the Uniform Guidelines for Employment Testing, those standards and procedures were dreamed up. That is, they thought that those standards were dreamed up by liberal ideologists determined to confound the technical experts. At least that's how they portray it in the appendix. The guidelines were actually based in and largely taken from the standards and definitions of test development established by the American Psychological Association, the American Statistical Association, and the American Educational Research Association. In effect, the drafters of the guidelines simply sought to break down the erudite jargon of the experts into an ordinary language of steps, stages, and techniques that any personnel manager could understand and execute. The only violence done by these guidelines was to the mystique of psychometric practice. The consequence has been far from impractical and impossible. Take, for example, the fire department of the city of Minneapolis. In 1991, it determined to apply the guidelines with the best of experimental methodology to devise a test to select recruits from a diverse population of applicants in that part of the Midwest: African Americans, Native Americans, Asian Pacific Americans, Hispanic Americans, European Americans, women and men. It did so at a minimal cost, in a highly efficient period of time, without score adjustments, without race norming, without quotas, or any other psychometric bugaboo. The magic test yielded from a very dauntingly small pool of eligible applicants a list to hire a perfect representative spread of ethnic and gender. 15 men, 15 women, 20 European Americans, 10 minority Americans, broken down further, 10 white males, 10 white females, 3 black males, 3 black females, 1 Asian male, 1 American Indian female, 1 Hispanic male, 1 Hispanic female. Without needlessly belaboring this final point, let me just emphasize the way these results belie the conclusions of the bell curve. Are tests bad? No. Do they perform badly? Sometimes. Are tests wrong? No. Do they perform wrongly? Indeed, they often do. Are tests that are non-biased, valid, usefully predictive, possible at efficient cost, manageable administration, and without adverse impact? Are they possible? That is, of course, without the use of norming, separate standardizing, or quota impositions? The answer is absolutely. And we already know that that's the case. Dr. Baton, a much-loved and revered late professor of psychology here at Howard, used to say it best, to paraphrase him: all you need to do the right thing is to do the thing right. We can and we will continue despite the bell curve.
Thank you, Professor Banks. I'd like to offer a few remarks from the perspective of the National Urban League, and then we will open the floor for questions or comments from members of the media. The Bell Curve is a provocative yet profoundly troubling book. It wrestles with an array of domestic issues like rising income inequality and social dysfunction that are genuinely worrisome. But it's reckless in its use of scientific data, illogical in its leaps of reasoning from such data, and ideological rather than linear in the policy recommendations which flow from its analysis. Given these flaws and the emphasis placed on ethnic differences in intelligence, the authors, in our judgment, whether inadvertently or intentionally, give aid and comfort to racist attitudes about the inferiority of African Americans. Despite the authors' protestations about the innocence of their motives, we of the Urban League find this book unfortunate and unforgivable. It widens the breach in our society between haves and have-nots and between races at the very time when we need to strengthen our common bonds and commit to develop all of our citizens if America is to enter the 21st century as a more competitive and more civil society. In the end, the authors, in my view, were hell-bent on advancing a vision of society and on the place of minorities and the economically marginalized within it, which is neither humane nor inclusive, nor, in my judgment, is it even sustainable. Let me large. The mindset is fundamentally at odds with the prevailing American ethos that our people are perennially improvable and upwardly mobile. The authors virtually absolve society of responsibility for finding space for the economically marginalized in the emerging scheme of things. Instead, these unfortunates are consigned to a sort of economic, educational, and social oblivion in their impoverished urban and rural enclaves. Given the ability of television to remind have-nots repeatedly of what they don't have, and given the growing size of this marginalized population in our midst, the Mary Herrnstein vision strikes me as a surefire recipe for social upheaval someday. My second concern is the connection between IQ and genetics. There seems to be little dispute that African Americans score lower on intelligence tests than whites. What's disturbing, of course, is the author's contention that the difference is substantially genetically based and thus, by clear implication, unalterable and unimprovable. By embracing the genetics explanation, the authors depict as reasonably argue that environment matters enormously. As one said to me, if you plant two trees of the very same species on a mountainside below the tree line, both will prosper. If planted above the tree line, both will become runt trees. If separated, the one grown below the tree line will thrive, and the one above the tree line will suffer. So much, it seems to me, for genetics as the sole or even dominant determinant. This pattern of reasoning and of routine dismissal of contrary evidence is disingenuous. If nothing can be done because of genetics, then case is closed. That's quite different from suggesting, as the authors do, that there are indeed promising interventions, but that the impacts so far are modest. Far from implying that nothing can be done, the second observation by the authors in the book about the evidence could logically lead instead to the conclusion that these interventions should be pursued even more vigorously to see if more favorable findings result. Lastly, arguing that nothing can be done because of genetics is markedly different from observing, as the authors again do, that truly effective interventions do exist, but they're too expensive. The authors cannot have it all three ways. My third point, IQ and effectiveness. For all its emphasis on disparities in intelligence, the book makes short shrift of the crucial companion issue of effectiveness. After all, the ultimate challenge facing society is how to equip our people, all people, to become self-reliant providers and law-abiding citizens. Surely, the driving purpose of education and public policy today ought not be to sort youngsters according to whether or not they have bright futures or bleak futures. Instead, the aim should be to develop all children to become effective adults. What do modest differences in IQ matter if those deemed deficient can nevertheless be equipped to earn decent livelihoods and support their families? If those with IQs of 85 were valued workers a generation ago, only to be written off by the authors today, does the same fate await folks with IQs of 115 in the year 2000 as the economy becomes more complex in the next century? How curious, therefore, that Murray and Herrnstein concentrate solely on IQ differences and dismiss the good news that the gap between blacks and whites on scholastic aptitude tests has narrowed noticeably. The SAT plays a major role in college admissions decisions, and since the gain is attributable largely to rising scores by those toward the bottom, this means that more black students are becoming eligible for college and thus better equipped for the competitive labor market ahead. Surely, this outcome should be encouraged. Given the headway made, it's inexplicable that the authors would discount the significance of these gains and the value of the educational interventions that contributed to them. Most important, it amazes me that Murray and Herrnstein would dismiss as unimprovable the supposedly slow-witted African-American youngsters whose SAT scores have risen along with their life prospects. Since the American economy needs all the effective adults our schools can produce, the common sense and compassionate policy response to the SAT progress would be to press forward with interventions and investments that accelerate the pace. The least fathomable response under these encouraging circumstances, namely forgetting about these youngsters and the programs that help them, is the very one embraced by the authors. Next, IQ and employment. Here, too, the authors' ideology shapes their analysis. They make a big point of arguing that intelligence tests are the best predictor of job performance. The clear message, offered repeatedly, is that employers should simply administer intelligence tests and then select their workers from the top of the list. I realize that different jobs require different thresholds of minimal cognitive ability, but I also know from practical experience as an employer and supervisor over the years that applicants within a range of cognitive ability can do a given job quite satisfactorily. The most cerebral worker isn't always the most successful worker. Query whether Mr. Murray would select as his child's teacher someone who scored well on the teacher entrance exams, but who believes that youngsters named Murray are inherently stupid. Would he urge a retailer to hire a salesman who's a summa cum laude graduate from a university, but who's also painfully shy or downright antisocial? Would he, as the trustee of an organization, hire a CEO who's book smart, but who's disorganized and devoid of leadership skills? The author suggests that intelligence tests predict job performance more reliably than job references. Real-world employers know that job references can be worthless if they're less than candid, which is often the case. So that comparison between job performance and job references does not substantiate the author's point. The key is to reconstruct how a prospect fared in a previous assignment requiring similar skills and then extrapolate from that assessment how she or he will perform in the new position. Of course, intelligence matters, whatever it may be, but so do ambition, industriousness, leadership, curiosity, flexibility, and other relevant attributes unrelated to IQ test scores per se. Lastly, the return of social Darwinism. Murray posits a vision of the future which resembles a romantic form of feudalism. Happy, low-paid vassals do valued work in their enclaves, but they dare not dream of escaping for the good life outside, nor will society so much as finance the promising educational programs that might facilitate their exit. Once upon a time, people toward the lower end of the IQ totem pole could find a productive place in the American economy. Indeed, blue-collar workers were once deemed the backbone of the American economy and widely celebrated as such. Their earnings enabled them to enjoy middle-class lifestyles. This broad sharing of America's wealth contributed mightily to social cohesion, but no longer. The American economy has turned sour for the marginally skilled. While economic restructuring may lock them out of the American dream temporarily, there is nothing inevitable or irreversible about that result. A society moved by compassion and concerned about social cohesion could opt to include them. How? First, by building on the knowledge base of powerful interventions for the poor, and not by giving up as the authors do. By guaranteeing, as Murray and Herstein advocate to their credit, that those who work should be assured of a standard of living above the poverty line, but also by assuring that everyone who wants to or is expected to work has an opportunity to do so with dignity. And where there aren't enough private jobs to go around, this may mean creating public jobs at public expense to provide services that taxpayers genuinely want. It means enabling all people to feel valued, not just on their blocks, but to broader society. The hopelessness felt by inner city residents today is a harbinger of pervasive alienation to come if they're isolated further, as envisioned by the authors. What makes anyone think in this era of talk radio and television, shopping channels, and sophisticated advertising campaigns that the economically marginalized will accept their fate submissively? The bell curve, in my judgment, chips away at heretofore fundamental tenets of American society, and those are tenets of access, opportunity, inclusion, and broad sharing of America's bounty. In sharp contrast to the defeatism of Murray and Herstein, I believe our very future as a civil and prosperous society hinges on how determined we are to share the American dream with the least advantaged among us. This spirit of inclusion has historically set us apart from other developed societies. Squandering that distinction not only risks setting our society back, a sustained retreat will eventually endanger national security by undermining social cohesion. Thank you. Let me now open it up to questions from the floor. Jack, would you identify who you're with, please?
Jack White, Magazine. A question for Dr. Gould, raised by Dr. Norwood. Could you comment as a zoologist on Murray and Herstein's use of the concept of race in the book? As you pointed out, they classify people as black simply because they said they were black, and white because they said they were white. In fact, he was in the passage of that. Does that make sense from the zoological standpoint of the zoologist? That is meaningful.
Could you go to the microphone so they can pick it up on tape? I'm very sorry. If there are any other questions from the floor, please use the microphone on this side.
Right.
It's a good question, but I guess you got to repeat it.
Okay, let me repeat. I'm just wondering, I'm asking Dr. Gould if he could comment from a standpoint of a zoologist on the author's use of the concept of race in the book. They have a little passage where they identify people as they say they're using the definition, self-imposed definition. Blacks are those who say they are black. Whites are those who say they are white. I'm wondering if, from a zoological standpoint, that makes any sense, and if it does or doesn't, what are the implications for the rest of their analysis?
I don't think it makes any sense, but for once I don't blame them. I don't know what else they could do. The issue really centers on the fact that race is a social concept in America that is set by our lamentable history of racism. From a biologist's point of view, most of us are various mixtures, but due to the history of racism, anyone with enough black ancestry to be so identified has suffered so much from the outrages of racism that they have been thus identified within a society. From a biological point of view, it doesn't make any sense. But then from a biological point of view, the concept of race itself is not particularly meaningful. From a taxonomist standpoint, the only recognized divisions within species, and we're all of one species, Homo sapiens, are called subspecies. The subspecies as a category is not widely used anymore as a result of its arbitrariness. By definition, subspecies are segments originally geographically defined of variation within a species. And what's particularly striking about human beings, now that we have measured the genetic differences among our so-called races, and now that we understand enough of the paleontological record to have a good sense of when we evolved, is that despite some rather striking visual differences among us in skin color, hair form, etc., we are just so strikingly similar. There's so little genetic difference overall among our so-called races, and that is a result of the extreme recency of our common ancestry. It does look as though all non-African racial diversity in Homo sapiens only 100,000 years old or so. That may sound like a lot, but you do understand that to a paleontologist that really is a tick of the geological clock, and that's all it is. So I would say the very concept of race is not very meaningful.
Well, the point I would make is that, in particular, in view of what Dr. Gould has said, is that race has become a social issue. It has become a social issue which changes with social views. And if you're talking about genetics and inheritance, it seems to me that you've got to take account of what it is you're dealing with, which I don't think the book does.
Is it possible that in all the race... I'm sorry.
This is the problem that Dr. Norbert is getting at. If one is trying to conduct a study that is concerned with the influence of my perception of myself on my engagement, say, in a learning activity, then the way in which I define myself is terribly important. But if you're doing a study that has to do with my biological functions or the genetic makeup of me, who I think I am or who you think I am is irrelevant.
Let me, one caveat. We would like first crack to go to members of the media because this is a symposium principally for the media, so I'd ask that we try to respect that, and we'll run through those questions and then open up for others. Don't give up, but yes.
I have a question concerning the issue of testing.
Could you identify who you are?
Yes, Steve Holmes with the New York Times. Looking at tests like the General Aptitude Test Battery, the GATB test, which, according to the National Institute of Science, has been a fairly good indicator of job performance and a fairly unbiased test, we still have the phenomenon of blacks as a whole scoring lower than whites. I would assume the panel doesn't believe that this is a result of any sort of racial characteristic. Could the panel then address itself to what might be going on in the education of blacks in the society that keeps repeatedly showing up in this poorer performance on standardized tests?
Good question. Nancy, you want to respond?
I suppose if we really had an answer to that, things would be quite different. There are probably multiple sources that influence human performance. Education is one of them. We certainly know, since you referred to education, we certainly know that the quality of education that's available to most African Americans in this country is questionable, to say the least. I tend to place less emphasis on what happens in school these days than I do on some of the things that happen out of school. For example, an anthropologist by the name of Ogbu points to the perception of 9, 10, and 11-year-old boys that if they finish college, high school, and he claims that they recognize their chances of doing so are about 50% of that of non-black kids. But if they finish, they are likely to be unemployed. Their chances of being unemployed are about twice as high as a European American kid. And if they're lucky enough to be employed, that their income is likely to be about a third to a quarter less. And Ogbu suggests that their investment in what the school has to offer is reduced by about that much. So they are likely to be that much less involved in schooling. So even if we were able to achieve Ken Clark's notion of the best that we know how to do in education being available to these kids, their involvement in it might be quite less. The second influence has to do with the socialization to academic experience. My wife and I have 4 youngsters. They grew up in a home where not to engage in discussion, not to be reading, not to ask questions, not to inquire about things would have been unnatural for them. That is somewhat different from a lot of kids and many African American kids. So they come to the school, which is limited in its capacity to respond to them with social habits of mind that are not necessarily geared to prepare them to do the kinds of things that the test is eventually going to do. we could, extend this further. My friend Kurt Banks on the end might want to add something to this.
Well, let me just, I think Dr. Cole wanted to respond, and then Dr. Norwood and Dr. Ladner. Okay.
I think it's a sign of our wish as a society for simple, unequivocal answers that would lead us to look to genetics to explain group differences before we look at all the things that, in fact, this book shows us that's different about the social and cultural environment that different Americans grow up in this country. And to me, it's to choose the more distant, less understandable kind of explanation than the obvious, more understandable kind of explanation that the book, in fact, gives us data related to.
Dr. Ladner.
I was going to say that I think that educators need to rethink how best to teach children today, children and youths, and even at the college level. The home, the school, the environment, larger environment, and the media today have very powerful impacts on how and what children learn, so that we're not dealing with the tightly knit communities where there are mutually reinforcing influences from all of these institutions in the past, but rather students spend an extraordinary amount of time today watching television. They're very visually oriented. Education has to adapt to the new technologies that this generation is accustomed to using, but in a very positive way in the learning environment. I think it's a cop-out, essentially, to fall back on, as the other panelists have said, this whole factor of genetics. And one wonders whatever happened to this notion that of a bootstrap theory, that no matter what one's station in life is, what the accident of birth happened to be, that there are really no opportunities. I'm particularly concerned about college students, where we see reasonably low retention rates, but probably fewer than 100,000 African Americans who get to college each year, where in many cases more entering prisons than are entering college. How do we develop their human potential? How do we get more of these students through middle school and through high school? I think there's a necessity for more bridge programs. By the time we get to this IQ test and SATs and ACT scoring, it's at the end of the line. But education we have to rethink our fundamental assumptions about where to intervene, and I would say we intervene very early and often, and that we find the necessary supports that sustain children and their families through educational process at each stage so that they can ultimately become successful, productive members of the society.
Dr. Norwood?
I just wanted to add a word from Mr. Murray, one of the authors of the bell curve, and read you two quotes from what he called an apologia, really, in The New Republic. Quote, "Many studies have shown that the disadvantaged environment of some blacks has depressed their test scores." And another quote, "As of 1994, then, we can say nothing for certain about the relative roles that genetics and environment play in the formation of the black-white difference in IQ."
Dr. Banks.
Let's see this.
Well, then I guess we need a new answer. I just wanted to make a comment about the reverse process to that which we've been talking about. That is, if there's a difference in the test score, then what is there about the people who are being tested that has made them different, such that they score differently? The reverse is actually just as obvious, but seldom looked at, and that is, what is there that the test is testing about the situation, which the people have made different, that the test persistently reveals? And the reason why I bring that up is that there was a very large and extremely detailed, thoroughgoing project carried out in a major city in the United States on employment tests, looking at the issue of content validity and job relatedness. And it found something that was very interesting in its possible answer to the question that you asked. Why is it that in spite of everything, and even in spite of a test that has taken great pains to be culturally unbiased, why is it that nonetheless groups may continue chronically to score differently? One thing that they found in that project was that it was literally impossible to come up with a test measure that was job related that did not carry with it differences in the perception of the job and the way the job was approached by different people. Even once all of the appropriate criteria were used to dispose of that content which was disagreed upon, to dispose of that content which was disparate across groups, it was impossible in the final analysis to remove it all from the test construction. Because in essence, the test was doing nothing more than revealing the differences of the job that exists beneath the apparent job description surface. When you actually go to the job and see how women versus men, how Hispanic Americans versus European Americans actually carry out the job with equal effectiveness. What that suggests to us is that sometimes the persistent differences in scores across groups on job tests is a result of the fact that the job is not one job, it's not one unitary phenomenon. And when measured for different individuals and for different groups, will be measured in different ways because the job is different for them. And one way that we have of getting at that is through the kind of thoroughgoing research project that the Uniform Guidelines provide, and that has been carried out by at least some institutions in the past. These are data that do exist. These are projects that have been conducted. This is a state of knowledge that already is present.
I would like to respond to the question with an anecdote, and I realize that's risky, but when I was at the Rockefeller Foundation, I saw a video from a program that we funded on urban education, and in it I saw a 6th grade African-American girl talking about a project that she had been involved in, and her command of standard English was extraordinary. Her sentence structure, verbal acumen was really quite impressive. She even went off on a soliloquy about the distinction between strict and tough. And she just free associated about the distinction between those two words. I then learned that this 6th grader scored in the 2nd grade reading level, and I suddenly realized I wasn't even sure what that reading test result meant. It certainly didn't speak volumes to me about her intellectual or even her verbal ability. It spoke about some difficulty between her and the test. And I think that that's much of what we're saying. Let me ask next gentleman from the press. Are you from the media?
Jeff Campfire, Education Daily. And I was realizing as I listened to the previous comments that there may be some overlap with your responses to the last question, but I was just wondering if there was anything any of the panelists would like to add in terms of much has been made of the policy recommendations and implications of the bell curve, that big picture approach to education. I was wondering what do you think some of the message of the book to frontline educators and public education officers throughout the country is, and what you'd like those types of people to understand about the book, maybe?
Dr. Cole?
There are many messages in the book, but the one of immutability, you realize, is just strictly contradictory to the basic role of an educator. So anybody who believes that children cannot learn and cannot be taught, in my mind, doesn't belong in our schools today. And that's a fundamental and a first order of response to that. But I think one of the things the book does remind us is that while we have good evidence that we can selectively, in particular locations, in particular interventions, be successful in creating change and increased learning, therefore refuting the immutability charge, that in fact we've not been as successful as we need to be in large-scale mass interventions nationwide to have the kind of impact we want to have. And that's a serious problem for us that makes us need to reconsider. The question is not whether things can change. The question is whether we can figure out the kinds of interventions that will have the kind of impact we need. And it's going to take a lot of commitment and effort, funding from this society to do that. And that's one of the things the book does remind us on a constructive note.
Dr. Gould. I really view the book, for all its scientific trappings, as an ideological document. We know what Murray represents. I'm not trying to damn him by association. He represents the right-wing think tank mentality from which his funding derives and from which Common Ground and all his work represents. And the depressing message that he gives us, and I think he means it absolutely, is that because the differences are not only genetic but effectively immutable, that the vast expenditure of money in ameliorative programs is effectively wasted. He doesn't say it's totally useless, and that we would do better to acknowledge these realities and go back to this romantic vision of an age from his little Midwestern town where people helped each other. He has this wonderfully romantic notion in which everyone finds their place in a town. So if you're going to have a church auction, you send Forrest Gump out to collect the clothing, while you, Mr. Murray, do all the finances and the accounting. I mean, I happen to believe in that notion of neighborhood, but it's almost grotesque to think that could be any more than a palliation. Now, the main thing I want to say, and here I have to credit my good friend Alan Dershowitz with putting it this way in a private discussion, and I think this captures both the moral and the practical point beautifully. That is, we really don't know the causes of these differences. We really don't. That's the only honest statement. But think of it this way, since we don't know. It has to do with what are called Class 1 and Class 2 errors in technical parlance, but much easier to explain. Suppose Herrnstein and Murray are right. But since we don't know that, we continue to try our very best to help out, even though it can't be totally effective. That's one scenario. Suppose, however, that we're right, and that these are substantially remediable because the immutability assumption of those four is wrong, but we follow Herrnstein and Murray's recommendations. You see, the differential results are so great. After all, if they're right, but we do our program, what's the result? So we've spent some money and we've encountered some frustration. But think of the tragedy involved if we're right, but we follow their program, because then we have extinguished the human spirit in millions of people where it could have been acknowledged and nurtured. And that's ultimately on any cost-benefit analysis or moral argument where it comes down. Since we do not know, all we can do is follow our program, which I expect is correct, because the consequences of not doing so are so horrendous if we're right.
Next question, yes, sir.
Yes, Louis Friedberg with the San Francisco Chronicle. I was intrigued by Dr. Cole's comments about tests, where you made a fairly strong statement that these tests don't reflect something immutable about intelligence. And it seems to me that tests have been responsible, perhaps more than anything else, for reinforcing in the public's minds and individuals' own minds that there is something like intelligence. And also in terms of what ETS has told students about coaching, you can only, it's not going to help that much, it's only going to help you improve a little bit. What is your position on how much tests reflect intelligence? And I'm wondering whether you or the other panelists could say, if in fact tests don't reflect intelligence, shouldn't we do away with tests in terms of how they do provide gateways to millions of young people to various levels of opportunity?
I think tests measure some important human skills. You've used the word intelligence, which captures a very broad meaning that many of us carry around, and tests don't capture all my sense of intelligence. Some of the comments made here today, that the recognition that different people use different types of skills in accomplishing the same ends. Tests measure some things, some types of skills that I believe if we look at them, most of us agree we want our children to have them. They are an advantage in the society to have. It's the inference that either these reflect inherited and therefore immutable characteristics, or the inference that we then, the notion that we're going to solve this by throwing out the test has been a long, many often recommended scenario, and one that's in fact has very negative effects on learning when we've made progress and when we haven't made progress. The dilemma is treating it as if these tests reflect something that's immutable. That's the most fundamental thing we should not be buying about test results, and that's the fundamental position of this book. But we ought to look at the tests your children take. We need to look at what's on these tests, because in fact we'll generally say, well, those are some of the things I want my children to have, but only some of the things, and we mustn't be misled to think they're all the things. And we're not good in this country at acknowledging that there are multiple routes to the same kinds of ends and performance. We don't respect well the differences among people in the way they do things, and the tests don't help us with that very much, because they do present data on one trend, one type of kind of skill and performance.
Dr. Gordon?
I think it's probably in 1977 or 78 at the ETS Invitational Conference on Testing, Ann Anastasia, who's really, I think, one of the underappreciated scholars of psychometrics in this country, Anne suggested that we substitute developed ability for intelligence. And she argued that at least in terms of the measurement of the traditional measurement of intelligence, that's really what we're about. We're measuring the developed abilities of persons. Now, if I am in a situation of selecting people who I have some reason to believe have certain developed abilities, tests are a useful way of doing that. But when we begin to go beyond the recognition that this is an approximation now of the extent to which these abilities have been developed in this person, and begin to assume that there's something innate, something immutable, something really fundamental there, that's where we make the mistake. So that even though the president of the Educational Testing Service could probably not say we ought to do away with tests, I, not officially responsible to them, can say, no, I don't think we ought to do away with tests either, but they ought to be used more appropriately. Often in the debate around the elimination of testing, I remind folk that I'm old enough to be among the crowd who wouldn't have had a chance if there had not been a vehicle that was more objective than somebody's biased judgment about my ability. So that my ability to get a test score that would get me into a college was very useful. That's still a useful function of testing, but there are also a lot of abuses of it.
Dr. Norwood?
Well, I'm not very skilled and don't have very much knowledge about testing, and so I won't even try to answer the question that way. I do, as an economist, however, have some knowledge of measurement. And I think that this is a basic issue in everything that we do. We measure unemployment, and we have an unemployment rate. And many people say it's very wrong because people are out of the labor force and not looking for a job. They're working part-time and they're counted as employment. Unemployment doesn't really give us a measure of economic hardship, which everyone thinks is what we're really measuring. The point is that it's important to measure it because it does give us some indication of a problem that we have to deal with. Not to measure it would mean that we never at all approached it. What is important is that those who do the measurement, and I would compliment the Educational Testing Service in this regard, those who do the measurement or who are expert in the measurement really need to have an educational program so that people understand that which is being measured.
I believe we have one more question from the media, then we'll open up to others. Yes.
Andrea Stone from USA Today. As there is an increase in blacks entering the middle class, and also with the current controversy over immigration, millions coming in taking low-wage jobs, are we going to get to a point, or are we heading in that direction where the issue of class is going to supplant race and ethnicity as the great divider, and where does intelligence and IQ and the bell curve fit into all of that? Anyone on the panel?
Class has always been an issue in the United States and a condition in the United States if you define class as opportunity and as income and as education. It seems to me the real issue is that as we move forward with an increasingly globalized labor market where we will be importing many of the goods that are produced now by unskilled, low-income workers in this country, and where there seems to be a kind of bifurcation of the labor market within this country, will there be jobs for these people? In the short run, we clearly now have difficulties and will continue to have difficulties, but in the long run, I think we will be far better off. The important thing is that many of these developments will do two things, I think. One is that the whole globalization of the labor market, all of the downsizing we've had, has really honed our manufacturing industry into a position where it can become, and has become in many cases, much more competitive. The reestablishment of American manufacturing will bring jobs not just for highly educated people, but also many of those companies hire people to do many of the tasks that people with lower cognitive skills can do. So I think that's important. The second point is immigration has always been considered in this country something that has, in the long run, helped the country by bringing in new ideas, by bringing in new skills, by bringing in new kinds of people who have helped to move the country forward.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm Mary Hoover, Professor of Education at Howard and Chair of the Coalition in Defense of African American Education. I have a comment and two questions. My comment is to Mr. Holmes regarding the issue of what's going on in education that causes the students to test so poorly. And I think I'd like to give a non-blame the victim or vindicationist perspective on that, which is that for 20 years now, the education establishment and the media have ignored schools that work quite efficiently in very poor communities, effective schools, successful schools, 20 or 30 of them across the country. And again, it's an intervention that is effective if supported, if propagated, and continues, again, to be ignored. My questions are first to Dr. Cole. I'm very pleased to see you critiquing the bell curve. I wonder, however, if you would subject your own organization to such a critique. I appreciate the question by Mr. Greenberg, because the Educational Testing Service must take some responsibility for a book like the bell curve, for continuing to develop and publish biased tests. I'll give an example from my own experience as a person on test bias is one of my areas of research. I was invited to ETS to review the reading test, and a group of us stated the very areas that were biased. We spent a great deal of time for no money, which was all right. We're supportive of the cause, and wrote new questions. We were allowed to develop a new set of specifications for this test because the answers were all one method, and we know that no one method works. And the ETS professional supported us. We developed new specifications. Took great time out of our busy lives to write items, and the new test came out with none of our examples on the new test. So I wonder if you're willing to subject your own organization to a broad test of bias, not just the one or two people you have on board who are test bias experts, but to an examination of what actually happens in terms of the bias process. My second question is to the...
Could we get a response to this?
Okay.
I don't know of the particular instance about which you speak, but in fact, it's absolutely essential that the Educational Testing Service subject itself to precisely the kind of scrutiny, criticism, questioning about the extent to which we're supporting adequately the diversity of human capabilities, as you note. And we are participant in a number of kinds of projects to advance our own learning and our own considerations of broadening what our tests measure. And I think with pressure from you and other good citizens who wish to see us be more sensitive, that we'll continue to grow in that way. We have a number of activities, as you know, of the sort you described, and apparently in the particular case experience you had, we didn't respond very well to the kind of input we got. But we have a number, for all of our tests, we seek the kinds of very broad input and scrutiny from from groups of great diversity, and perhaps you know of an instance where we didn't respond well. I believe we could also find many instances where we have responded, and we seek to keep responding better.
Okay, thank you. Your second question?
The second question is to the entire panel. Every decade or so, we see the right wing coming out with a book like The Bell Curve or Dinesh D'Souza's book and so forth, and we've commented on the extremely poor scholarship in the group. I'd like to just add an example of the poor scholarship. They've eliminated completely the voluminous research on the fact that African American children up to the age of 2 test ahead of all other groups. We're not trying to establish superiority, but in a situation where we're consistently said to be testing at the bottom of the whatever the poll is, we should look at the research that Amos Wilson has done on the developmental psychology of the black child. Cognitively, linguistically, in every motor skills and everything that you want to measure, African American children are superior to other children up to the age of 2. And again, it's very interesting. The IQ starts at what age? 2. When the gains of African American children have been, that research, entire research, was completely eliminated from the book. Again, so we know that there's very poor scholarship in the book. But we allow ourselves to buy these books and come together to discuss these books. We respond. But I wonder if this group of progressives would be willing to do what the Heritage Foundation and other right-wing organizations do to develop books such as The Bell Curve, Dinesh D'Souza's book, and so forth. If you would be willing to bring us together, progressive forces, to respond in a scholarly way to these kinds of attacks that, again, come out every decade. Is there something that we can do rather than come together and respond to The Bell Curve? Can we not produce something to allow our scholars, such as Dr. Sylvia Johnson, one of the national experts here at Howard, on testing, in addition to those of you on the stage, allow us to also have something to say that is disseminated, propagated, and discussed in the way that we're discussing this.
I think your basic point that we need to be more proactive in laying out an agenda, but I think also the point that made by the panel, we need to be sure that the interventions that we back are powerful and persuasive. One of the concerns is that while we all agree that human beings are extraordinarily improvable, the systems that serve them don't seem to do that well, and the instances you cited are far too few in number. So one of the dilemmas is how do we get entire education systems and districts to respond, or what are the alternatives to the ways in which education is structured now so that we can improve outcomes for young people. I think your basic point is quite well taken. Let me ask this gentleman next. Would you identify yourself, please?
My name is Ta-Nehisi Coates. I'm a sophomore in the history program here at Howard. I think it was Dr. Gould who earlier said that the book represents like the conservative think tank here in America. I'm curious with the conservative or Republican takeover of Congress, and with the president becoming more conservative, and with the possibility of a Republican president in the next 2 years, what effect would a book like this, or as you said, the return of social Darwinism, have on public policy?
Well, I think it poses a challenge for all of us to build new visions from the ground up and to substantiate the power of those visions. I think if we believe that all people are developable and improvable, as I think all of us here do, then we've got to get the systems and the programs and interventions that produce that result. We've got to document that, and we have to build a powerful constituency for those kinds of interventions. I happen to think that that kind of work will be going on in communities across the country, and that a new kind of view of the kinds of communities we want to live in and what we want to do for our children will bubble up from the ground. I think we're in for a near-term difficult period, but I would hope that more compassionate and inclusive views of programs in education and intervention will bubble up from people who say, I want to live in this kind of community. I don't want to return to feudalism. That's the bet I would place.
May I make a comment on this one? I think clearly we've got to do more work. And the community development, economic development, the intellectual development that has just been referred to. But I interrupted to speak to the pessimism of your question. I don't think we have to have a more conservative president elected in 2 years. If you go back and look at this most recent election, the data I read suggests that about 39% of the population voted. The winners won with 52% of the vote, and the major new voters in that 39% that gave them a 52% victory were working class white males. Now, if one looks at the program that was voted in, it is not a program that's going to support working class white males. I think if we get out there and do the kind of political work that we also need to do, that the majority of people in this country will not retreat from the democratic, liberal traditions of the country, but will embrace it because we've got no place else to go. The other direction is going to wreck the nation.
Dr. Norwood.
I would just like to say that it seems to me that one of the challenges that we have, which could be in the long run favorable, is that we clearly are going to be seeing a pushing out of government programs away from Washington, away from the federal government, into state and local governments. If you think about it, it is quite clear that many of the programs that have been most helpful to racial groups who have been disadvantaged and others have been at the local level. And it may be that that kind of focus, if we can make that kind of focus on local programs which have succeeded, that in the long run, this will be of great benefit to disadvantaged peoples.
So, are you saying that, like, the federal government will stop taking so much responsibility for social programs and, like, local government will start doing more?
I think in many cases we will see the Congress pushing things out to governors, to local areas, and many of the programs that have been, the intervention programs that have been successful, have been programs in local areas. If you can expand on those, that may in fact prove to be a very useful kind of approach.
I don't want to hog. That discussion pushes my point even more. Suppose California becomes a more powerful seat of human action. Anybody who's been out there recently can see how the tax rebellion there has limited that state's capacity to speak to human concerns. I don't think we've got any alternative but to get out there and do something politically to represent the mass of people in this country, whether the action is in Washington or in the state capitals.
This gentleman's been dying to get a question in. Yes, sir.
Thanks. My name is Jim Joy. I have a question for Dr. Gould. I believe that, like you, Dr. Murray is also a member of the faculty at Harvard, right?
No, Herrnstein was the other author who died a couple months ago.
In light of that, in light of the fact that, one, legacy students at Harvard, sons and daughters of Harvard alumni, do not do as well as African-American students at Harvard, and two, in light of the fact that probably of all Ivy League schools, Harvard has a pretty disgraceful history of racism, anti-Semitism, sexism. Why, when this book came out, before Herrnstein died, did not professors like yourself, Alan Dershowitz, E.O. Wilson, Robert Coles, say to the administration, listen, we're really embarrassed that this kind of crap is being associated in any way with Harvard?
I'll tell you why, because there's a rather arcane phenomenon known as the First Amendment, in which many of us happen to believe. I'm not into suppressing Mr. Herrnstein's right to publish this book. I, in many ways, regretting so much as I do the social impact it's likely to have. I rather wish he hadn't, but that has nothing to do with his right to have done so. It is most emphatically not the task of an institution to censure its individual professors. If we did that, then the university would have a star chamber sitting in judgment of absolutely every one of its scholars. That's a worse vision than the bell curve. That is not what you want. But you are right about one thing. The most widespread affirmative action program in Harvard University is for its legacies, who do not, however, do as badly as you, as you say.
Just so everyone will know, legacies are sons and daughters.
Sons and daughters. People give a lot of money and were there themselves. Yeah.
Let me ask whether there are any quick concluding observations from members of the panel about the implications? No? All righty, well, I would like to thank everyone for participating on the panel, and for those of you who came out today and for the coaching questions you asked, thank you very much. We are